Well, hi everyone, and hello to you, Naomi and Maggie. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel. It is such a delight and a thrill to speak with both of you about your incredible work.
Thank
Hello,
you,
hello
Amy.
For
Amy, hello Naomi.
Uh, for folks who are tuning in to this wonderful festival, my name is Amy Brady. I'm the deputy publisher of Guernica Magazine and the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Review of Books, where since 2017 I have written a monthly column called Burning Worlds. That column explores how contemporary novelists are writing about climate change and thinking about all the different climate-related issues in their fiction. About a year after that column, I expanded the project to a monthly newsletter, also called Burning Worlds, where I speak with novelists and artists of all different kinds about how they're thinking about the climate crisis. Today, it is such a pleasure to be speaking with two fabulous novelists, Naomi Booth and Maggie G. And to get us started, I think that I would like to hear from both of you about what initially drew you to the subject of climate change and why you are so moved to write about it in your fiction. Maggie, you've been writing about climate since at least the 1980s. Let's go ahead and start with you.
I think for me it's part of a more general love of nature and interest in our place in the natural world. I grew up in the country and came to the city, as so many of us do, for a grown-up career. In the early 1980s, I became aware of problems like acid rain in Europe, and actually some of the work was in Germany. And I linked that somehow to Venus and the fact that Venus had lost its livable atmosphere. Um, and the change was going on from the 1970s idea that we were going back towards an ice age. In the 90s, of course, things literally hotted up. And I think it's important that people feel it for themselves. And as a gardener, I noticed that plants were coming out at the wrong time, that the Japanese can't remember exactly what it was, in the garden was coming out in November and December when it should have waited. The quince, Japanese quince, it shouldn't have come till spring. And I wrote a novel called Where Are the Snows at the very beginning of the 90s, linking climate change to the excess of the 1980s. And so on through, two more books, The Flood and The Ice People, looking at climate change in different ways, but always linking it to human beings as part of nature, as one among many fauna and flora.
Great, thank you. And Naomi, what about you?
Well, I can remember quite distinctly a particular event that I attended that I suppose was the beginning of maybe I'll call it a dark epiphany about climate change. And it was an event that was held at the University of Sussex. I was studying there at the time. This was about a decade ago now. And a brilliant Australian writer called Rebecca Giggs came and spoke and read from her work. And I suppose, like a lot of people, I knew some of the facts about what was happening to the environment, but I managed to ignore that in my day-to-day thinking about life. And I managed to kind of push that into the background of my thinking where so many other unresolved anxieties reside. And this talk that Rebecca Giggs gave, she said something that really got under my skin. She said that often when we think about climate change and when we think about environmental contamination in particular, which is one of my interests, we think of it as something that happens over there. Either we think of it as something that happens, if we're lucky enough to not be immediately affected by it right now, we might think of it as something that happens over there in another place in the world. But more fundamentally, we think of it as something that happens to an environment which we see as being outside of ourselves. So it happens to the air, or it happens to the water, or it happens to the land. And she said, fundamentally, what writers can help us to see is that environmental change is happening right here in our bodies. You know, that we are made of permeable skins, permeable tissues. Everything that is outside of us is also inside of us. And that thought really lodged in me. And I suppose thinking through some of the more horrible ramifications of that led to the development of my first work, and I suppose has made me continue to be interested in the idea of eco-horror and what different genres can do to make us feel that reality of climate change in our bodies.
Great. Thanks, Naomi. I look forward to speaking with you more about bodies and climate change in a moment. But Maggie, you are the author of 13 acclaimed novels, and you have a new novel called The Red Children forthcoming in January of 2022, I believe. And we now have the great pleasure of getting to hear you read from that novel. So let's listen to that now.
Around 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals were climate change refugees or migrants moving south through Europe to find warmer homes as the world cooled towards another ice age. Gibraltar, the peninsula at the foot of Spain, is the southern tip of Europe, and there they could go no further. Gibraltar may have been their last refuge. In my new novel, though, I imagine that Neanderthals survived in the hundreds of miles of caves and tunnels that in real life run below Gibraltar. They survived, that is, until today's climate change, which is moving in the opposite direction, as we know, towards heat. And that drives them to want to move north again. At the same time, Gibraltar's plans for a huge, ambitious underground development, which has the ironic selling title of Paradise Now, threatens to destroy their caves. And protesters organise an unofficial poll. Main Street, Gibraltar. Always a maze of heat and gossip, the place where people go to show off new clothes and parade new babies, to see who's eating sweet churros in the blaze of late morning. Usually the older inhabitants, understanding the sun, come out later, dressed more modestly, as the day, even here, begins to cool down. But recently, days do not cool down. Recently, all Gibraltarians swarm like burnt ants in the street. There are posters everywhere. Universal poll, yes or no to the massive underground development. Wherever there's a poster, people stand and argue. They loathe Paradise Now. They love Paradise Now. The old caves must be protected. The old caves are too much respected. Apparently, the First Minister wants it. Apparently, the First Minister will stop it. No one knows anything for certain, but if the polling station opens, they'll vote. In the long, calm night before the illegal poll, hundreds of small boats, some little more than rafts, converged on Gibraltar from all over the world, landing at Rosier Bay, Catalan Bay, Sandy Bay. Both the Royal Navy and the Royal Gibraltar Police explained afterwards they were simply overwhelmed by the numbers. Or maybe finding the boats carried neither cocaine nor terrorists, just people coming to vote. Maybe they made no attempt to stop them. Next morning, the whole rock of Gibraltar seemed to shake and tremble as the sun caught the edges of the waves. The limestone of the rock, dumb in sleep, was opening into the air, one by one, secret mouths. Unnoticed, unguessed-at caves, 200 unknown, but 300 or more, an infinite number, are there, where thousands of years ago sea wore notches of tide into the stone. Gibraltar's most secret caves yielded their creatures that morning, crawling or flying out into the light. Alpine swifts, starlings, martins and wrens who use the cave mouths as roosts, tiny spiders too, scuttling below them, while high-pitched pipistrelle bats were still straggling in from their night on the wing. Beep, beep, beeping. What's happening? Now other creatures stumble out too. Bigger, heavier, noisier, wrinkling up their eyes at the light, then with one accord starting to hurry to get somewhere. Tall, broad creatures, half-dressed though they're wearing their best, naked torsos and broad, strong, shoeless feet. Human creatures, but different. Large-headed, short-limbed, bright-eyed under strong brow ridges, some with the marked jawlines of Basques or Celts. Not Basques, not Celts. They stay close together as they walk. Some are laughing, some walk upright and triumphant, others are muttering, "Is it a trick? Once they've been seen, can they ever go back?" "We can never go at home in any case if we lose this vote," says one clever young woman. "So we vote. It's our homes they're destroying. We're the world as well as Gibraltar. We matter. We vote. We come out." And Gibraltar's first people, the Neanderthals, march boldly, heavily towards the top of the island. See how many others have come to join them. Other roughly dressed, oddly dressed, half-dressed people, all shapes and sizes, descended from who knows which ancient humans, maybe the Hobbit people of Indonesia, maybe Denisovan giants on the steppes. Coming across half the world to help them, all the world's first peoples. One species, however much lovers of ranks and gradations slice us into splinters. Ancient man, modern man, hominin, human, sapiens, primitive, race, nation. No, we are one. Look, here's a tide from the other direction, up via the main island road where the young men race in their cars to impress their girlfriends. But today, the whole width of the road is blocked by walkers, townspeople, modern people. Shirts and ties, dresses and t-shirts, also up early. And the macaque monkeys lope around the edges, puzzled, for when people are walking, not driving, the macaques can see they're monkeys too, not strange, cruel princes. Two ravens mimic the panpipes of the Colombian Indians who play as they walk, and admire semi-naked delegations from half a dozen uncontacted tribes in Brazil, while the Batwa of Uganda begin to hunt rabbits because they are hungry, waiting, like others, thousands of feet above sea level along the narrow windy path on top of the Rock of Gibraltar to vote, as they pass the polling point, yes to one side, no to the other. Thronging together, they don't need words. They smell friendliness, speak with smiles, touch their chests and stretch out hands to their fellows. On the margins, painting the whole in beauty, the butterflies soar up and hover over the queue. Swallowtails, Vanessas, clouded yellows and Cleopatras, mating in the hot summer breeze and spinning across towards pinky grey Africa in the distance. But first, should the earth be torn apart? Vote now. Last chance for the universal poll. The whole 10-hour sequence of bodies was observed and filmed in case of dispute. Once dark fell, the footage had to be checked and the figures recounted. Meanwhile, various officials declared the poll had no significance at all. Indeed, it told you no more than the Catalan vote of 2017. And look where that ended up. Had the Catalan vote for independence told the world anything about what the people of Catalonia really wanted? Well, yes, a stubborn secretary taking notes in the meeting muttered, but she was just a woman with family in Catalonia, so no one listened. In the bars downtown, which filled up very early, the drinkers were in despair. Such a very long walk up the rock, in blazing heat, but all, in the end, for nothing. Did we actually dream the whole thing? The Environment Minister asked the First Minister, who had invited him to go for a walk before breakfast. International observers have validated the result, said the First Minister, grinning. But see what our Gibraltar Chronicle says. He unfolded the newspaper stuffed in his pocket. Two ravens circled above, curious. Far below them, the two ant people, both of whom they knew to be very important in the world of humans, were laughing and clapping each other on the shoulders, as happy as if each had just eaten another bird's egg for breakfast. Grown men, however tiny they look from above, are not slim, but one seized the other by the waist, and his friend put a hand on his shoulder, and they danced, they danced, they danced, though the ravens couldn't hear music, like children, happiness filling their lungs with air. Pole, whole earth, says no. And the paper blew away across the world, and in through thousands of windows, and shimmered across the world's internet in an electric shiver of lightning, which might start life or send it in another direction.
Thank you, Maggie. That was wonderful. So that was a selection from your forthcoming novel, The Red Children. And what I love about that reading is that it does what I think climate fiction in general, the best of climate fiction in general, does so well, which is that it links the climate crisis to other larger or other large systemic issues. And in this case, specifically, the migration or refugee crisis. Could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write, not just about climate change, which you've been doing for many years, but also specifically about migration and how or why you see those two things linked?
Yes. Well, of course, in a way, books should never be single-issue books, because if you write a single-issue book, then your readers will feel preached at. And as a writer, you have to make these connections, and you're absolutely right that this is really a fairy tale about migration and about climate change. However, the two have always been linked, because great movements of humans and of other species have always been linked to climatic change, and therefore the change of the plants and animals that the megafauna ate. So they have to move as climate change moves their diet. I live in Kent on the southeast coast of England, and we are literally the place, in a way, where British history began, where the Romans landed, where the Vikings landed, the Germans, the Belgians, in a sense of the original tribes. And so we're an island tribe, and we are all migrants. How else did we get here? And we are a mix of all those migrants. So it's a bit like what the narrator of The Red Children says. It's a bit like what the Neanderthals say. We're all one. We are one species. It's slightly random the way we divide modern humans and Neanderthals, for example, since modern humans have up to 3% of Neanderthal genes. We share 95% or above of our genes with every other species, including, charmingly, a lettuce. So really, we're all the living flora and fauna of this planet, and both climate change and migration affect us all. And I suppose all writers can do is try and make that fact imaginatively felt for the reader.
So, Maggie, I just had one follow-up question to that. It's so interesting about how you say that there is little difference between animals and humans when we really start to break down the science. I find that so interesting because in your novel, you give agency and a voice to non-human characters. And in the Western literature tradition, outside of children's literature, that's such a rare thing. We don't see that very often. So could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to give animals, and I'm thinking specifically of the ravens in your book, why you decided to give them a voice and agency in your story?
Interesting that you talk about children's literature, because I'm very influenced by Hans Andersen, and he had stork narrators in some of his fairy tales. It has been done, you're right, it's rare, but Virginia Woolf, for example, wrote Flush through the consciousness of a spaniel. But really, it's just that the more you watch animals and love them, it's impossible not to see that they have purpose and they have emotion. They're not just bundles of instincts. And that also, I think, has been one of the great intellectual advances of the past 3 decades, that science has started to say, no, animals, non-human animals, are merely a different kind of animal, different kinds of brain, equally complex but different. Very interesting work, for example, on primates and corvids. And corvids are ravens, and corvids are highly intelligent and can make jokes and play games, and they're very good mimics, which is very important at a certain stage in my narrative. It's fun, of course. That's partly why writers write. If we have fun, maybe the readers will too.
Thank you for that, Maggie. Naomi, I'm very excited to hear you read from your novel, Sealed. So let's listen to that now.
This is a reading from the very beginning of my novel, Sealed. And Sealed tells the story of Alice, a character who's 8 months pregnant at the start of this novel. And her and her partner, Pete, are leaving the city that they live in for somewhere more rural. They're attempting to escape a strange condition which has begun affecting people's skin in the world of this novel, which is a kind of speculative version of Australia. And the condition within the novel is called cutis. So I'll start at the very beginning and then we'll skip forward to a place in the novel where Alice is remembering some of the reports of cutis and what she's trying to leave behind. We came out here to begin again. We came out here for the clear air and a fresh start. No one said to us, beware of fresh starts. No one said to us, God knows what will begin. I can't sleep again. I lie on my back in bed listening to the house settling down into the not quite dark night. Pete is wet with sweat beside me and humming periodically in his sleep. He turns suddenly, his legs kicking out as though he's falling, and then he drops, heavy and still. I lift the sheet to try to let some air across my skin. It's so hot that I feel like I'm tightening up, the skin on my stomach running all over with burning electrical sensations. I must not scratch. I must not scratch. I remember a woman at one of our antenatal classes who must have been as far gone as I am now. Impossibly large she'd seemed at the time. She'd let go, she said. She just couldn't hold back any more. She lifted her peach smock and all over her swollen, low stomach were deep, livid scratch marks. They'd grazed in some places, and you could see where the old blood was crusting over and where she kept on opening herself back up. I've had to cut my nails right down, she said, and lowered her shirt. Calamine, the course leader said, and self-discipline. And the rest of us were still staring, open-mouthed. I've got to get more air. I get up from the bed and go over to the window, trying to jam it up even further, but it's already open, as far as it will go. I look out over the garden. Something outside is ticking away in the bushes. There's a slight breeze through the jarrah, but the air's warm and thick. Nothing's going to bring relief from the heat. I lie awake or half awake for hours. I'm so hot, I wonder if I'm starting with a fever. I listen to my heartbeat, hard and unpredictable. I suppose Pete's right. I'm the strange one, thinking about it all the time. Pete is the normal one, assimilating cutis to the list of everyday risks, just like Mara and Paulie and everyone else. For them, it's just one other thing, adding to a background hum of distant dangers. A fading anxiety drone, melanoma, heat events, cutis, wear sunblock, avoid danger spots, get treatment. But back when it first started, I wasn't the only one interested in the details. There were mainstream news reports every day. All of the big networks ran features. I've catalogued most of them in my files. A small mountain town in Peru, the site of an American smelting company, had a well-documented outbreak. In the TV news report, a young man wearing a bright orange tracksuit sits on a rocky outcrop in front of an industrial tower. He grins straight at the camera, seeming to enjoy the attention. He gestures dramatically. He makes his hands into fists and places them against his ears, and then hurls his hands out explosively, fingers splayed, miming an eruption from his head. The translator tells us that the man had gone to sleep one night, his ears perfectly normal. But he woke up in the night to a terrible itching, like something was burrowing into the skin around his ears, and when he tried to scratch himself, he felt something there, something in his ears, and he knew immediately that it was the skin worms. The reporter tells us that this is the local term for cutis. In the boys' village, more than 10 people have been affected in the last 2 months. The boy shows his ears proudly to the camera. There are welts along the curved folds of his inner ear, cauterized wounds that are still glistening red in places, but they're scabbing over, crusted black towards the edges. It still itches, the boy says cheerfully, but now he knows he will be able to hear. The doctors were kind, and the smelting company gave his father money for new clothes and medicines, he says. He gives a double thumbs up to the camera. Another report focused on a large number of women living in a village along the Citarum River in Indonesia. The reporter wears a mask as she walks along the side of the river, telling us about the geography of the area and the large proportion of women affected. The Citarum River is the most polluted body of water in the world, she tells us, and that's why she's wearing a mask. But the children, who occasionally run across her path, have wide open mouths, gaping delightedly as they dash in and out of shot. The river doesn't appear to move at all as the reporter walks alongside it. It's covered over with greyish debris, a barely drifting scurf of different bits of plastic. In occasional patches, close to the side of the river, the debris clears inexplicably, revealing still ovals of black water. The reporter is wearing a linen suit, and she moves her hands as she walks. Her voice is only slightly muffled by the mask. The Citarum is the longest river in West Java, she tells us, and 7 million people live in its basin. Large textile factories further downstream are major waste contributors, and the river contains high levels of lead, mercury, and arsenic. The rice paddies that used to surround the river have stopped producing food, poisoned beyond productivity. The land has been sold off at rock-bottom prices to hydroelectricity firms. The report cuts now to the inside of a village house. Several women sit in a circle. Some are elderly, their faces grave and tired. A young woman has a baby tied to her front with a bright blue piece of cloth. She cradles him and her mouth is flat, dimpled at the edges in disappointment or distaste or surgical reconfiguration. The women begin to speak in turn, and their words are dubbed over with a young woman's voice in English. I didn't know what was happening, one older woman is saying in her own voice, and then in the young translator's voice. I felt sick and tired, but that's not so unusual. The river has always given me headaches. Then one night I went to bed, and the skin around my nose became itchy. I rubbed at it, but I couldn't get at the itch, and I could feel something growing there. When I woke my husband, he shouted and pushed me away. I went to a friend, and her son took me to see a doctor the next day, and he treated me for cutis. I have no children, the woman says, looking miserably at the floor, and my husband will not have me back in the house. There is no one to look after me except for my friend. The woman begins to weep, and another comforts her. The woman's nose has been reopened, but the surgery looks basic. The nostrils are bullish, outlined in red, crude circles newly produced by the cauterization. These reports kept on coming for a while, and the most hard-hitting were the ones where the symptoms were caught on camera. I've archived footage of a Sri Lankan woman whose mouth was lost in folds of crinkled skin, filmed just before her surgery, of 2 Bolivian children, brothers, whose ears were muffled in a new epidermis, and horror stories of ad hoc surgeries, of mishaps and infections. I've saved those too. But gradually the stories stopped coming, and people in the city seemed to forget about it. People are still forgetting. People like Pete, he might have seen symptoms just this morning. Is it mad to think about cutis all the time, to document its effects, to think about the people it's claimed, the people it's sealing in right now? Or is it madness to sleep soundly, forgetting all about the very thing that might seal you into your own dreams? My mother's the last thing I think of. She's the last thing I try to shut out before I finally drift into a fitful sleep. Thank you.
Wow, Naomi, thank you so much. That was such a powerful selection from your book, Sealed. Your novel is so incredibly timely and even prescient because it's about not just climate change, but about a pandemic. And but it's a novel that you wrote and published long before COVID-19 began circling the globe. So I'm so curious to ask you, why did you decide to write about climate change and a pandemic when you did?
Thanks, Amy. I suppose that novel was composed, I now think of it as sort of being one long anxiety dream or anxiety nightmare. I wrote it quite quickly, and it did come from a number of things that I was feeling increasingly anxious about. And I suppose, as Maggie was just saying, we know that climate change is linked to lots of different, everything is linked. So why wouldn't we think about all of the things that are affecting us together? And I suppose that now seems to be the way many of us are beginning to think about disease and contagion. It's been interesting and worrying to see reports about habitat destruction and the likelihood of further zoonotic transmissions. So, the idea that the more we destroy natural habitats, the more likely we are to have pandemics, the more likely we are to see diseases crossing over between different species. And that's not to say I knew a lot about the science of that back when I wrote this novel, but I suppose I felt a number of anxieties that were related to climate change and a number of anxieties about physical safety, and those for me kind of coalesced around the idea of contagion and pregnancy in relationship to climate change. But I discovered something very strange just in the last few months, in fact, which is, the novel uses a kind of what seemed to me a very exaggerated version of a disease, a kind of almost kind of mythological disease where people are being sealed into their skin as a kind of self-defeating protective mechanism from the body. And I read just a few months ago in a recent issue of Granta, a literary magazine that's published in the UK, that there has been a sort of the discovery of a real disease, which is very similar to how I imagined cutis. This is a disease called chytrid. A writer called Anita Roy has written about it in Granta, and it's a disease that affects the skin of newts. The poor newts, these poor creatures whose skin is ever so sensitive, because newts, like many amphibians, are especially vulnerable to changes in the air and water, have begun to be terribly affected by a skin disease, to the point where a third of newt species are now at risk of extinction. It's been described as one of the greatest catastrophes in terms of species extinction. So yeah, a very strange experience in which even the most outlandish way that I could think of to imagine our bodies responding to the environment has actually been surpassed by what is happening to newt species.
Thanks, Naomi. That's remarkable that you somehow predicted a disease that you didn't even know about yet in your novel. But perhaps I shouldn't be surprised because, as I said earlier, this novel does feel so prescient in so many ways. And in that regard, I just have one more follow-up question for you. You mentioned pregnancy, and in that selection that you read, you mentioned a character who lamented not having children and therefore no one to take care of her. Your book also stars a protagonist, a young mother who is pregnant during a good portion of the book. Kind of like the way that Maggie writes about animals in a way that seems so different than so many of our contemporaries. You write about pregnancy, and that is still something that doesn't have much of a presence in the Western literature tradition. Though I think we're seeing more images of that, it's still fairly rare. Why did you decide to write about pregnancy and motherhood, as well as climate change?
Yeah, a few different reasons, really. I mean, one was, as I was just saying, I think it was a novel born of anxiety, and one of the things I was thinking about at the time was the possibility of trying to become pregnant and the way in which that intensified certain anxieties that I had. I'd read the wonderful work on immunity by Eula Biss that talked about her own experience of pregnancy. I think she describes it as an anxiogenic condition, one in which your everyday anxieties about the world around you might become increased for a while. And I really noticed this when I started thinking about the advice that you're given in the UK when you become pregnant, for example, involves restrictions of foods, involves avoiding environments that might be unsafe. For example, if you work in a dry cleaners, you're advised to stop working there. I think there's a way in which, if you do become pregnant, you become newly aware of the potential toxicity of the world around you. And then, of course, we now know that all of the things that are around us are detectable, for instance, in breast milk, potentially in utero. So this sense that I suppose I had of pregnancy as a condition in which the things that are inside of us might be made subject to the kind of the things around us which we are not in control of. And of course, pregnancy is a condition of vulnerability that is not equal. All pregnant people are not equally vulnerable. You know, we know there are great health inequalities based on social inequalities, racial inequalities. We're seeing that in the way that COVID affects people as well. So I think pregnancy was interesting to me in the way it intensifies our vulnerabilities to the environment. And also I was conscious myself of not being able to readily call to mind characters who are heavily pregnant and who are doing things. So there is a kind of sense in which at the end of this novel, my main character, she's not exactly an action hero. In fact, she's not a hero at all, I would say. But there is a sense in which she is active and she's doing things. And I was interested in seeing a heavily pregnant character doing things.
Thank you, Naomi. My next question is for the both of you. Naomi, you have spoken so elegantly about anxiety in your novel. And Maggie, your novel reveals, I think, a widespread fear, or at least a suspicion that arises when people feel like they're in an us versus them or other kind of situation. And so, while the both of you have talked about how your novel reflects real world events and details, I'm wondering if you both could speak to how your novels reflect what we might call the mood of the moment. Because I think that's such a powerful aspect of both of your work, that you're not just holding up a mirror to the physical changes that arise from the climate crisis, but also our emotional or psychological condition as a result of climate change. Would you talk a bit about how you capture the mood of our moment? Maggie, why don't we start with you?
I, it's an interesting thought, but it's probably one we can't help. We can't help writing the moment, in a sense. Even historical novelists are unconsciously writing the mood of the moment. But I slightly resist the idea that I do that, because remember, I've been writing about climate change because I thought it was of huge interest to me and would be very important. And I've been doing that for nearly 40 years. So, yes, I am writing. I personally do not write about the past. I'm interested in the present and the future. My climate change books have been set in the future, usually, because you have a little more freedom to do thought experiments. I think I'm trying to focus attention where attention might not be. So I am trying to, I suppose I'm trying to convey a vision of connectedness, not just anxiety, because actually, and not just body anxiety, because one of the things I'm saying is look at this beautiful world, enjoy your healthy body, make sure that other people, other living beings have their space and their room to realize their potential. And I am trying to say, yes, people are afraid of migrants, and along the coast of Kent, migrants are arriving in their thousands from war zones, and climate change refugees too. But we will learn that they are us. We will learn that either we welcome them and let them become British, and join our genes in the bigger picture to theirs and appreciate what they have to bring us, or we decline into a kind of helpless, embattled state. And in Germany, of course, you've shown the way with welcoming migrants. And I think in the same way, we have to open up our definitions. We have to see that humans cannot survive alone. I mean, why do parents buy soft toys that their children don't much play with, that are bears, that are giraffes, that are all kinds of animals, cows, sheep, who were once part of our daily life? And perhaps parents have noticed their children and they themselves are a little lonely. And until we see ourselves as all connected, we will be in great danger.
Thanks for that, Maggie. Naomi, I would love to hear from you as well. Do you try to capture the mood of a moment in your work?
I think for me, this is partly a question about genre, and what type of novel you might set out to write or find yourself writing. I wasn't conscious of trying to capture a mood, but I think as I developed the novel and edited it, I was conscious of trying to create a mood. So my novel, I suppose, Sealed, at any rate, not other things that I've written quite so much, but Sealed does work within broadly the horror genre, I would say. And so there is a sense in which you try to intensify some of the more anxious and horrified currents of contemporary experience, I suppose. And I have thought quite a lot about that since publishing the novel. And, you know, certainly I don't think it's the only way to go about dealing with climate anxiety. And myself, I still wrestle with this, and how much hopefulness is our responsibility to inject into a work of fiction, for example. So I often rewrite my work so that it's more hopeful than my initial vision, because I can tend to be a little bit pessimistic. So Sealed, for example, this might shock some readers, but the final version of Sealed is actually significantly more hopeful than first thoughts I had for it. And partly, I think, as writers, and I think Maggie does this brilliantly, but I think there is a way in which, obviously, creating a certain mood for a reader is part of what compels them and part of what keeps them in a world of fiction. But it's also, I think, for me, become more and more important that there is a sort of openness which allows for the real possibility of a future that is not yet written. You know, I don't know how the environment, how we will act collectively to respond to the climate crisis in the coming years. But as a writer, I think I have to leave open the possibility that we will work together to better the situation, while making clear the dangerous, perilous point in history which I think we're in right now.
Thanks for that, Naomi. It's so interesting that you brought up the concept of hope in novels. And I would like to parlay that over to you, Maggie, to hear your response on that. Do you think that hope or optimism, however you define those things, because I know they're fraught terms for many different people, do you feel that they play a certain role in fiction?
I certainly do. I don't think we have a responsibility to offer hope, because I think you can't tell writers to be responsible for anything other than making a really good book or trying to do that. I think we have responsibilities as humans and as citizens, and those are real. But what I've found, you have to remember, because I've written, you know, I think of 4 or 5 now climate change books, I've done it in many different ways. So the apocalyptic mode is one that I have written and enjoyed, and they are, of course, they work in a way a bit like disaster movies, The Day After Tomorrow or Earthquake, and they are, in a way, the reader can experience safely a terrifying disaster. Some people will be put off even reading those books, and some other people may read them and think, oh yes, but I survived it, and they can then forget it. So I'm trying with this new book, The Red Children, something different to my apocalyptic The Flood, which is, as you would guess, about a tsunami, and was rather like Naomi's, written the year before it happened, and something different to The Ice People, which shows very rapid climate change destroying Europe's civilizations. I'm writing something gentler, and perhaps it's also to do with age. Late work, I'm not saying I'm Shakespeare, but if you look at late Shakespeare, there is a comic mode, there is a sort of distancing, and maybe I'm trying to give my readers air to breathe. I think there's a place for all these kinds of writing, and I think all of them have as an aim to empathically feel your reader and make your reader feel your characters, and thus perhaps you extend their range, and we hope it will inspire them perhaps to live more safely, more richly, more imaginatively. And that hope, I think, I certainly don't write to make people unhappy. I write to tell the truth. And I write because people love art, and I love art.
Thanks, Maggie. I love that line. I write to tell the truth. Since both of you brought up the concept of genre, I'm very curious to hear, regardless of what genre you're writing in, if it's fiction, is there something that you think that fiction in particular can tell us about the climate crisis and perhaps all the ways in which it's related to these other crises that you're speaking to? Can it tell us something about these things that perhaps a news report or a work of nonfiction or even a scientific study can't tell us about these things? In other words, what makes fiction such a unique mode of storytelling for climate change? Um, and Naomi, if you don't mind, I'd love to come back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Um, this is such an interesting question, and I suppose in some ways an unanswerable one, because certainly I've spent my writing life trying to think about the sort of knowledge that fiction produces, if it does produce knowledge, or the sort of experience that it produces that might be different from other forms of experience and knowledge. And sometimes I think of it in terms of fiction being compelling. This is an overused word. This is a word we often see in reviews. But the idea that fiction can make you stick around with something, can compel you to engage with something over a sustained period of time that you might read about in the news or engage with very tangentially or briefly through a kind of doom scrolling. This is what we call it now, isn't it? When we look through bad news stories kind of compulsively. And I suppose I hope that fiction, I suppose my fiction has tended to be interested in the darker consequences of climate change and climate anxiety. I hope that fiction perhaps allows us to have a sustained engagement with certain possibilities, but I think inherently does so in a way that is a kind of testament to human ingenuity as well, both in terms of the characters that you might be encountering, but the act itself of making art in the face of crisis, which I think all of the writers and artists who are doing that are attesting to that desire to make something, to continue to make something, to be creative and ingenious in the face of crisis.
Fascinating, thank you. Maggie.
Yes, interesting question. Luckily, we don't have to choose, because it's essential that we have scientists and journalists who are gathering facts and who are promulgating facts. But it's certain that novelists reach a different audience, and they may reach audiences who simply have had enough of upsetting facts, or who have resistance to upsetting facts, or who have a political refusal to take on board political facts. I think in a way artists are incredibly lucky, and scientists must sometimes feel that, because they have to check everything that they say. Everything has to be falsifiable. Everything has to be cross-checked with a community of scientists. I mean, I'm so happy that I'm not asked to write international climate reports. I am merely asked to imagine. And imagining, perhaps I can make things real and engaging and emotionally true for readers. And maybe, I mean, we have to believe that human beings are capable of change. We have to believe that they're capable of happiness. And I just hope that some of the readers who read even the apocalyptic books of mine, like The Flood, I hope that they will be moved by what I try and show of the extraordinary beauty and complexity of the living world, and perhaps be moved to do something to enjoy it and to protect it. And in The Red Children, that's what I'm saying all the way through. Love what we have, and what can we do? What can we do to make that stay with us?
Fantastic, thank you. Maggie, in an essay that you wrote about your work as a climate fiction novelist, you wrote a sentence that I can't stop thinking about. I've been thinking about it since I read it. You write, human beings are art-making creatures because of a broader human characteristic, the urge to transform. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean, what's both attractive about us and terribly dangerous is our desire and ability to innovate and to invent. Now, we do see invention in other species, and I'm sure we're not capable of noticing the degree to which they do innovate, and they do transmit culture. They do, we can see this, but of course, it does seem to be clear that we not only innovate, but we innovate things that have a physical, material existence. We innovate cities, industries, we innovate in a way that produces vast desire for consumer goods. And that makes us awfully dangerous. And yet, it also makes us artists. And our art is certainly as elaborate as bowerbirds. Our art is playful, our art is a way of communicating. And when people are creating art, they're not usually dangerous. If you take that to the beaches or the parks when people are playing, which I think is a form of innovation, they're not usually fighting. So we have to see ourselves as innovative creatures, and that can be good or it can be very bad.
Great, thank you. Naomi, you write about a pandemic and climate change, and you had this fascinating anecdote about newts earlier. So, sticking with the topic of kind of art and what it means to be an artist, I'm so curious to hear from you, who is someone who is undoubtedly an artist. Do you think that it's important to also get the science right about climate or any other kind of large systemic thing that you write about in your fiction?
Hmm. Well, um, this is a question that needles me from the point of view of someone who's imagined disease and imagined it in a very broad brushstrokes way. So I think again, it probably this might sound like I'm avoiding the question. I think it depends on the genre once again. So I think sealed is not a detailed scientific model of what may happen in a few years' time. So the science, the science isn't there in certain respects. I'm not paying attention to the science as a modeler might, and I suppose there are different kinds of people who approach speculative fiction and science fiction in terms of that very detailed engagement with scientific modeling. I suppose I do aspire to what Maggie said, which is to write something true, but of course there are many different ways in which things can be true. So I suppose in Sealed, I hope that, well, at its best, if it ever succeeds, it does so on the basis of being a fable that is based in real issues about climate change, but it is working as a fable. So although I am very interested in the science of newts and what is happening with newt skin, I don't think the some of the kind of gorier bits of Sealed that I describe are the way that human skin works entirely. There is a kind of artistic license there in how I'm imagining the body in response, and I guess that's the kind of, there's a symbolic truth, I hope, in what's being discussed there, and the way I present it, which I think has its basis in science, but I suppose this is my way of covering my back in terms of the medical research that I did for that novel.
Great, thank you. I love that phrase, a symbolic truth. I will be thinking about that for some time. Thank you. So, something that I am so curious to ask any writer who writes about climate change, and I'm especially excited to ask you both because Maggie, you've been writing about climate change for so many years now, and Naomi, it's been at least a couple of years since your book came out. Climate change, while many people think that it's a very slow moving phenomenon, it actually seems to be happening quite quickly. Our understanding of it is changing very rapidly, and just in the last few years, we are seeing effects from climate change that a few years ago scientists would have predicted we wouldn't see for a very long time. So, as two people who follow the climate crisis, who write about it in your fiction, is it difficult to write about something that could be completely different, or perhaps our understanding of it could be completely different before you've even finished writing the novel? Or is that something that you even think about much when you're writing about climate? Maggie, why don't we start with you?
I do think about it, and I actually agree with Naomi, and perhaps I'm even more dependent on. I try and read all the science that I can, merely because it's a source of ideas and a source of it's grist. I mean, you can't just write novels about nothing. I think maybe this is the reason, because the field is changing so quickly and the facts are changing so quickly. Maybe that's why I'm quite careful to set my novels up to 20 years, 30 years. The Ice People was set, I think, 50 years in the future, because one can then speculate safely. You see, I think the same is true of writing about pandemics. We really don't know what pandemics the future will bring, but we can see a pattern, as Naomi said, of zoonotic disease emerging because of the way we live. So many of us live far too closely to each other, and because of the way we eat, the way all of these things that we do that damage the planet. So we know that pandemics will emerge. We don't know which ones will emerge, and so we have to find something that is plausible within the scientific constraints. And for me, certainly, a huge moment was when I learned at the beginning of the 90s that the work of a Belgian botanist, a woman, had revealed that climate change can come, huge climate change, if you look at the pollen record, can come over between 1 and 2 decades. And that was revelation. Until then, I had thought we lived a slow alternation between ice ages and more and warmer times. But when you realise that, that makes a real difference. A scientific fact makes a huge difference to how you see the world.
Thanks, Maggie. Naomi.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because although there perhaps is a sense that things are happening very quickly, also the evidence has been there for decades now. I'm thinking a little bit about a discussion I heard recently, the philosopher and critic Omi Baba speaking about COVID in particular and the way in which we describe these as unprecedented times. And he was arguing that I think he was arguing that they are at once unprecedented and also entirely predictable. We've many of the things that have brought us to this point have been seeded for many years. So it's a strange thing. I think we feel at once that we are in an unprecedented crisis, but that's partly because we haven't been listening. We haven't been listening for many years, or we've heard things and they've been in the background and suddenly they're in the foreground. So I think just to reiterate what Maggie said, these things can happen within a cycle of decades, and also we have had the information for decades. We've just perhaps been choosing to put that to the backs of our minds, both kind of individually and collectively, for a while.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that we've known about climate change for decades. Because what continues to surprise me as somebody who is very aware of the climate space and who has the great pleasure of speaking with writers like yourselves and even occasionally scientists and journalists is that people who aren't necessarily focused or read much about the climate crisis, they are surprised to hear that we've known about climate change for as long as we have, and that yet still so little has been done. And so perhaps this is a bit of a weighted question, so I ask you to take it in any direction you like. The very fact that you write about climate change in your fiction and bring it to a wider reading audience, do you see that as a form of activism or education? Maggie, why don't we start with you?
I see it as, I mean, I'm probably, even being optimistic, I'm in the last, I'll be lucky if I get another 30 years of life, very lucky indeed. So I see it, from my own point of view, as part of trying to understand. Trying to understand what life on this planet at this moment means, and trying to share that, because I've spent years in education trying to share that with others through my writing and through my teaching. The fact that people don't see it is not surprising, in the sense that I'm surprised that intellectuals don't see it. I'm surprised that literary people are not a little more interested in science. They are becoming more so. But I'm not surprised that people who are struggling to live, who are trying to put food on the table, who are trying to look after children, like most living beings, survival is the imperative. And as it happens, we're actually rather lucky to have survived this long. I'm 72 without a war. I was born just after the Second World War. I hasten to add, without a war on our own soil. There's been plenty of wars elsewhere. So in a sense, I think people then just start trying to survive economically, trying to better their children's lives, and they simply don't feel they have time to think more widely. And you just hope that at some point they will find that time. And I suppose the job of writers and educationalists, if this is imaginatively exciting for them, is to share that knowledge and to try and make that knowledge something that people can bear to take in. But it's no good blaming people for not seeing it, I think. We just have to find a way. And there's so many different ways. Naomi's different from mine, and all of us are doing something different from the visual artists, but we're all trying, I think.
Thank you. Naomi.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I suppose in terms of people focused on day-to-day survival, I do think this is a big, this is not just a question of individual choices. Individual choices might factor in. Some people have very limited choices, and this has to be something that we tackle collectively, and it has to be something that our governments enable us to do if there is going to be any level of success, I think. In terms of that question of activism, I have enormous amounts of respect and gratitude to activists who are working in this area and in many other intersecting areas. And I suppose I'm probably too conscious of my own complicity to state that I am an activist writer, but my one of the most rewarding things about writing would be the thought that the book connected with people who were petitioning for political change, or that in some way it made a difference towards a moving consensus that pushed us further in that direction so that there could be real political change.
Wonderful, thank you. So this panel that we're all a part of today is a part of a larger literary festival where hopefully many folks who are tuning in are going to be interested in reading both of your books, but also perhaps getting inspired to read others. And so something I like to ask all writers I admire is, who are the writers that inspire the both of you? Whether they write about climate fiction or excuse me, whether they write about climate change or something else. Naomi, what about you? Who inspires you as a writer?
Well, I think I've mentioned a couple of writers who really inspired me early on to think more deeply about climate change and contamination, and those were the writers Rebecca Giggs and Eula Biss. There are a few writers who I'm reading right now who I am very excited about and inspired by, and actually two of these, I have them somewhere on the shelves behind me. Two of these are writers who are usually poets and who've written prose fiction, I think for the first time in both cases. So the first one I'm going to mention is Rebecca Tomash, who wrote this amazing recent collection of short personal non-fiction essays called Strangers, Essays on the Human and the Non-Human, and they're really pithy reflections on lots of different things to do with animals and the environment and non-human beings. But in particular, the thing that really fascinated me here was her discussion about climate grief as part of one of the essays, and the difference between what we might think of as climate despair and climate grief. And she makes such interesting points about different affective and emotional states in relation to the environment that I think intersect with questions of what fiction might do and how we might respond to the things that are going on around us in a way that allows us to be effective and to produce change. So that's one work that's really inspiring me. Another is Elizabeth Jane Burnett's The Grassling. Again, Elizabeth Jane Burnett is a poet who has written wonderful poetry, including Swims, which is a collection about wild swimming that's laced with reflections about water contamination. So a kind of really interesting marrying of enjoyment of the natural world and apprehension about the way in which it might be dangerous. And this book, The Grassling, is a kind of remarkable excavation that's partly about soil and grass and place and her place within it. I think she describes it as a geological memoir. So I absolutely love that book too. And I've just started reading Catherine Yusuf's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. Again, this is a work that's partly about geology, but in it she really looks at that term, the Anthropocene, and digs down, if you like, into the history of that term and the way that it intersects with histories of race in particular. A really fantastic and thought-provoking book. And she links her work, I think she is a geologist, but she links she's very indebted to histories of Black feminist thought and contemporary Black feminist writers. So a really fascinating book.
That sounds fantastic. I'm going to be adding that to my to-read list as well. Maggie, what about you?
Yes, oh, so much really. I'm going to go back in time and I'm going to stay in Africa, and I'm going to talk about Doris Lessing's Mara and Dan. A great novel. It was her personal favourite among her novels, though it wasn't the most successful. And it is the story of a young boy and a young girl who move north through Africa 40,000 years into the future, when climate change, bigger climate change, has meant Africa is entirely dry and the sea between Africa and Europe is frozen. And she has an unrivaled way of giving you that ache of longer time, and also of talking about survival. And I was lucky enough to become friends with her in the last 10 years of her life. So she had quite an influence on my thought. And I think one thing that she said was, all civilizations end. So maybe when we're feeling really depressed, we can tell ourselves that there is a certain fragility to our over-greedy society. And although, alas, we love people and we love carbon life, and we love, if we're lucky, we love our children, our grandchildren. If we also love other people's children and grandchildren and want them to survive, that's very sad. But that life will go on, and that we have to try and make a fist of it. And I think that's what Mara and Dan says, but in a wonderful adventure book, an unforgettable adventure that Doris Lessing takes you on. And I have to say, though, that I think it's very important to read some science. And as from Richard Dawkins's The Selfish Gene, my understanding of evolution, I think, was what sort of opened my horizons as an imaginative writer. And that in the visual arts. So I think, we're very lucky. The reason why perhaps I feel I have to write these books, not as all my practice, but as a part of my practice, is because I am not working in a factory. And my daughter has left home, and somehow not having that close-up struggle means I'm free to read, I'm free to write, and I am able to imagine the larger world of climate change, which is harder for people to do, I think, other than through absolute imminent disaster. And so I write my books, and I hope people will read them, and I hope they all understand in time.
Thank you, Maggie, for that wonderful sentiment. So I think we are coming up close to the end of our time together. So I just have one more question for the both of you. I am sure that the festival attendees are very eager to hear what's next for the both of you. Is there anything that we should keep our eyes and ears ready for? How about you, Naomi?
Sure, thank you for that question. Well, my most recent novel published just last month, it's called Exit Management, so I'm still a little bit in the world of that novel in my own head. And it's a novel, it's very, very different from Sealed, but it's a novel that certainly is interested in the idea of the repression of certain elements of climate change and contamination of the world. So one of the main characters, for instance, Lauren, who is one of three main characters in this novel, is intermittently preoccupied with the idea of plastic objects in particular, and plastic objects that that might not break down, that might kind of resist decomposition. I don't think that's really sold the novel very well, but that's the most recent novel I've written, and I'm now working on a collection of short stories which will hopefully come out. It will probably be 2021 when that comes out, and the collection of short stories is really perhaps one of the organizing principles of that collection is encounters with animals in the middle of the night. It's perhaps quite a niche organizing principle. It was partly inspired by the disruption to my sleep patterns that I had when I was feeding an infant child, and the idea of strange nocturnal encounters, and a chance to kind of focus on the non-human a bit more as well within those stories.
I can't wait to read it. That sounds fascinating. Maggie, what's next for you?
Well, first I will edit The Red Children, the book that I've read from today, and then I think I'm going to write a sequel to The Ice People, which was my science fiction climate change novel of the mid-1990s, and it will be called Luke's Tale. and it will take one of the characters in the Ice People forward into the future. And in a sense, I never quite finish a book because I run the characters through every book. And so I suppose my work won't finish until it finishes. And it's all one story because it's the story of, as I say, of what I've understood, I suppose, and how little in the end we do understand.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very excited to read the novel in its final form, as I'm sure so many folks watching this panel today are. Thank you both for this time. I have absolutely enjoyed this conversation, learning more about your work and your thought processes, and just talking about the very important subjects of climate change and literature.
Thank you,
so
Amy.
much, Amy.
Thanks. Lovely to meet you, Naomi.